Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Ilana Kurshan about her memoir, Children of the Book, and how she balances her love of reading with raising her 5 children.
I thought to myself, wait a second, how did this happen? How did I sign on for a full-time job that's incompatible with what I most love to do? And it took me a while to come to terms with what it meant to be both a reader and a mother. And the solution that I found was really to connect with my kids by being quite literally on the same page as them.
Ilana Kurshan is the author of If All the Seas Were Ink, winner of the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. She has worked in literary publishing both in New York and in Jerusalem as a translator and foreign rights agent, and as the books editor of Lilith magazine. She also teaches and studies Torah in Jerusalem, where she lives with her husband and children. In this episode, we'll discuss how Ilana reads herself into the Talmud, claiming a connection to figures often imagined as distant from women's experience.
I identified much more with the men of the Talmud than with the women of the Talmud, because here I was, an independent woman, supporting myself and studying Torah, of course, and I thought to myself, well, by the Talmud standards, I'm really a Jewish man. And it was really the men of the Talmud who became my heroes.
And we'll hear about how reading to her newborns felt like creating the world.
I watched in wonder as each of my kids learned how to point with that tiny finger, the nails the size of like sesame seeds, right? As I read aloud and thought about how that was really how God created the world in the book of Genesis. God spoke the world into being. God said, "Let there be light," and by the power of God's word alone, there was light. For each of my newborns, it was as if the worlds were being summoned into existence then and there. And those were insights that I don't think would have come to me had I not had that experience of reading with my children.
All that and more coming up next. Welcome to the 5 Books, Ilana. I imagine that many of our listeners consider themselves readers, but in your new book, Children of the Book, you show us a whole new level of what it looks like to live a life fully shaped by reading. Your first chapter begins with the birth of your oldest child, and you tell us that you brought an anthology of romantic poetry with you to the hospital, and that just after he was born, they laid him on your chest and you read him a poem. So Children of the Book is very literal for you. And then from there, you weave the story of the Torah, the 5 books, if you will, into the story of of your reading life with your children, the plot of the books themselves that you're reading, and your children become the plot as well. What is it, do you think, about books that helps you process the world around you and the world within your own family?
Books have always been the lens through which I see the world. I have always felt that I am more in the space of the book that I am reading than in whatever physical geography I might be situated in. I remember when I was a child, we took a family vacation to Florida, and I was reading all the Ella Montgomery books. I had moved beyond Anne of Green Gables, and I was reading the Emily of New Moon series. And I was so convinced, to this day, I still think of that vacation as our vacation to Prince Edward Island, because that's what I was reading about. And so surely that must have been where we were. And that continues to be the case for me. I keep copious journals, and I always, when I look back in my journals, you wouldn't really know where I am because they're much more about what I was reading at the time than where I was living.
I love that. And how did you come to this weaving with the Torah and your children's reading lives?
I think as parents, especially as parents of young children, we spend so much time reading the same books over and over because kids love hearing the same books again and again. No sooner have we turned the last page than they want us to go back to the beginning. And this experience of constantly rereading really resonated for me with what I think of as very central to the Jewish experience of reading, that is the liturgical cycle of reading the Torah. And as I began to think about, I'm someone who reads from the Torah regularly, chants from the Torah regularly in my synagogue. I always have my head immersed in the biblical text wherever we, the Jewish people, are in that biblical text because, of course, Jews the world over read the Torah in synchrony. But at the same time, I was also rereading all these books to my children, and it really led me to meditate on this experience of reading against the backdrop of another rereading experience.
Maybe you could just tell us more about, I know you've written for Lilith, you are a translator. Tell us the full breadth of your literary activities.
So I like to say that I work with books at all stages of their production. Like if you imagine a factory with a big assembly line and books are what come out at the end, then I like to be involved at every stage of the conveyor belt, as it were. I work for a literary agency here in Jerusalem where I read manuscripts, both in Hebrew and in English, that are submitted. In Hebrew, it's generally finished books that have already come out in Israel and are being considered for translation into English, and also manuscripts in English that have not come out yet that are in search of representation. I edit books. I translate books of Jewish interest and also novels. I also translate children's picture books in rhyme. That's sort of my specialty. I've done a lot of those. I really like doing rhyme. And I teach Jewish texts. I study Jewish texts. I just completed a 3-year course of study in halakha, Jewish law, at a place in Jerusalem called Har El. And I teach at a yeshiva in Jerusalem for students who come from abroad. I teach Talmud and Midrash, and I teach the weekly Torah portion. And I write as well for that institution where I teach. I write a weekly column, a weekly Dvar Torah column, commentary on the weekly Torah portion, sometimes in prose, sometimes I do it in poetry. Every year it's a different theme. Oh, and I am officially the book reviews editor for Lilith magazine, and I also translate Israeli fiction for publication and excerpt in Lilith. Magazine is very, very close to my heart. So I think those are all the main ways in which I'm involved in books in all their. I would say, like, I volunteer reading Hebrew books to the blind because I love reading out loud to people. And as my children are getting older, they're not always as keen on it as I am. So I find new guinea pigs or whatever.
I do not know how you have the hours in the day, but that is amazing. If you've been listening along and thinking about what your books might be, we'd love to hear about it for an upcoming listener series. Tell us about 3 books that had a big impact on your life. 1 Jewish book from childhood, 1 Jewish book from adulthood, and 1 book that changed your worldview. Then just record a short voice memo with your list and email it to us at team@5bookspod.org. We just ask that you keep the length around 5 minutes. Thank you, and we really can't wait to hear from you. Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood, All of a Kind Family by Sydney Taylor. So tell us about your Jewish life as a kid.
So I grew up in an observant Jewish home. My father, now retired for many years, was a conservative rabbi of a shul on Long Island. He was in the same shul for about 30 years. So we grew up enmeshed in a very tightly knit Jewish community. It was like an extended family. Everyone in the synagogue, they were our aunts, uncles, cousins, extended family. And we grew up also always having members of the congregation in our home. We lived on the synagogue property. Out our window, we would see every car that came in to the synagogue in the morning for the morning minyan. So it was very much a very immersive Jewish experience. My siblings and I, we all went to Jewish day school. I went until the 8th grade and then went on to a public high school. But all through, even as I went to public school, where I was really the only observant Jew in a very large Long Island public school, I very much felt like I was steeped in Jewish learning, Jewish liturgy, Jewish living. That was the air we breathed.
Okay, so tell me why you picked All of a Kind Family. You write about it in Children of the Book and rereading it, but I want to hear about when you discovered it for the first time.
So I think the All of a Kind family novels were probably the most formative Jewish books I read as a child. I'm sure familiar to many of your listeners, the story of 5 sisters and a little brother born a little later, growing up on the Lower East Side during World War I. The novels are episodic, with each chapter featuring a self-contained narrative. So the sisters prepare a giant pancake to serve to a neighbor. They go on a family outing to Coney Island. They shop for the Sabbath with their mother. And many of the chapters feature Jewish holidays, so the girls will watch Papa build a sukkah. Ella, the oldest sister, writes a play for Purim. Several of the sisters have to miss out on the Pesach Seder because they're in quarantine for scarlet fever. But they're also very deeply steeped in American culture. They celebrate the 4th of July. They interact with their Italian neighbors, even take one of them under their wing. So the books are really about living fully in the Jewish world and also in the secular world and feeling equally comfortable in both. And I think that's why the book struck such a chord with me, having grown up in a tightly knit synagogue community and then going on, as I said, to public school where most of my friends were not Jewish. We lived in a town that was predominantly non-Jewish. So the all-of-a-kind family experience of living in both worlds really made sense to me. But I think what I loved most about the books was that the stories felt so real to me that when I thought back to them, and even today when I think back to them, it's as if I'm recollecting my own memories. The black and white illustrations had become seared in my memory, like images from a family photo album. I was convinced that I, too, had waited in line with Sarah to confess to the library lady about a lost book. I had eaten broken crackers and penny candy in bed with Charlotte and Gertie. I had spied on Ella when she tried to have a private conversation in the parlor with her boyfriend. I was convinced that surely these stories, so vividly recollected, surely they had to be true.
And then fast forward a few decades, and you're reading it with your children, and you write, even though the books are the same, I am not. So tell us a little bit about how your life changed and what it was like that was different when reading All of a Kind Family through the lens of parenting 5 children.
So I read the novels to my children in Jerusalem, where we live. We speak English at home, but their education is entirely in Hebrew. They write much more comfortably in Hebrew. And I really felt the responsibility of bequeathing to them the heritage of the books that I grew up with and loved, because they didn't grow up with the experiences that I had. So they knew nothing about what a tenement was, the Lower East Side, all the aspects of American culture that the author Sidney Taylor explores. It wasn't lost on me the irony of this, because Taylor, who at the time she wrote was really hailed as a pioneer in ethnic literature for children, she wrote these books in part to normalize Jewish culture for American children. She's always making explanatory remarks like, Sukkot is the Jewish Thanksgiving, parentheticals. But my kids knew all about the Jewish holidays that Taylor chronicles. They knew what Sukkot was. They just didn't know what was so special about the 4th day in July, or why little Charlie was afraid of Santa Claus, or, what have you. So I was, in a sense, normalizing American culture for my Israeli children. But it was important for me to do all that explaining because I wanted my children to have those indelible memories that I had. I wanted them to also eat broken crackers in bed with Charlotte and Gertie, what have you, because that was such an important part of my childhood, as it were. And it was also really fun to witness how my kids reacted. And this had nothing to do with being American, being an Israeli, but just being kids at different developmental stages. So I remember one evening we were all in my bed, my 3 oldest kids who were very, very close in age, a son and then twin daughters. And I was reading them the last book in this series, Ella, All of a Kind Family. It's a book where Ella runs off and joins the vaudeville and she's in love with this returned soldier. Anyway, I won't go into all the details, but it's the last chapter of the last book, and it's the romantic climax. Jules, Ella's boyfriend, is about to propose to her. He's preparing to propose to her. He's trying to feel out where she is emotionally, and he says to her, "Penny for your thoughts, Ella." And my girls were sitting there just riveted. Like, what was Ella going to say? Were they going to get married? And there was a whole feminist element at that point because Ella's thinking about her career and where the crossroads she's in her life. And my son stops me and says, Mom, how much was a penny worth back then? I said, and what are you talking about? He said to me, it probably was worth a lot more. So a penny then. And then he started going into this whole time travel, money saving scheme. And it was just such a realization for me that when you're reading with children, you never know where their heads are, and their heads can be in all different places. And it's such a fun experience and such an enriching experience to connect with children through books and understand where their heads are. And I'll just add that part of what deepened the experience of reading those books with my children was that at the same time there had just been published a critical biography of Sydney Taylor called From Sarah to Sydney by June Cummins. I was reading that book alongside, and I've done this a few times with books. I read Laura Ingalls Wilder, a critical biography of her while I was reading my kids' Little House on the Prairie. I read Beverly Cleary's biography when I was reading them the Ramona books. And that really added another level of meaning for me because I was fascinated to discover just how much of those novels are autobiographical. And also what wasn't. Like the Papa character, Taylor's father worked in a junk shop just like Papa, and the author makes the very interesting point that just like he recycled junk and then sold it, in a way Taylor was recycling the junk material, the material of her childhood, and giving it to us as readers. On the other hand, the mother character is very, very different. Taylor's real mother had a very hard time adjusting to life in America and was for a long time very depressed, even suicidal. Anyway, so it was very interesting to see what truths Taylor stuck to and where she softened or a little bit idealized her characters to make them more palatable, perhaps, for young readers. So that was a lot of fun for me. And then the last thing I really thought about as an adult reader that I don't know if I realized as much as a child was just what a central role libraries played for Sydney Taylor as a child and what a central role they play in the novels. And I write a lot in my book about libraries. I love libraries. I worked in libraries all through high school and college. And it made me realize just how writers for children and middle grade novelists really foreground the importance of books and reading.
There's a real thread in your book about balancing your love of reading with the responsibilities of parenthood and how reading to your children bridged that gap. Can you tell us about the beginnings of that habit?
Yeah. So I've always read voraciously. I say, I don't like to do anything that can't be done while reading, which is why I can't drive and I'm a dreadful cook because, I take the lasagna out of the oven when I finish the chapter, not when it's baked, or I don't even bother setting oven timers. I'm terrible. So I've always been a person who, goes through the world with my head in a book. And when my oldest child was born, I remember thinking, I was in the middle of reading while I was in labor. In fact, I worked with a doula who, she remembers what I was reading when each of my kids were born, and went out and bought all those books because she said they have to be very good if you can read them through your contractions. Anyway, I just assumed that, once my child was born, I would go on reading in the hospital, and I brought all these books with me. And I remember lying there in the hospital bed, just a couple of hours postpartum. The baby was lying next to me in the glass bassinet of sorts. And I thought to myself, well, this is really rude. My child has been alive for 2 hours and I'm just going to ignore him and read to myself. I can't do that. So I started reading out loud. And of course, I wasn't reading baby books. I didn't own any baby books. I was a new mother. I was reading at the time a Shirley Jackson novel. Well, it's a memoir/novel about raising her children in a house full of books. It was very appropriate. And I just began reading out loud, thinking, okay, well, now my son and I can have our heads in the same space. And in those early months of infancy with each of my children, I read out loud to them always while breastfeeding, sometimes, to lull them to sleep. And then I reached this point where as my kids got older, it somehow became really difficult to read to them, somehow, right? Because suddenly they wanted me present in mind as well as body, right? And I had to be fully present in a way that I was not used to because my head was always in the book. And I thought to myself, wait a second, how did this happen? How did I sign on for a full-time job that's incompatible with what I most love to do? And it took me a while to come to terms with what it meant to be both a reader and a mother, or how to be a reading mother. And the solution that I found was really to read out loud to my children, not just the books I was reading, but also, of course, books they wanted to hear, and to really connect with my kids by being quite literally on the same page as them.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood, A Bride for One Night by Ruth Calderon. Can you tell us a little bit about Ruth Calderon and this book, and also how you came to be the translator for it?
Sure. So this book was one of the first books I read in Hebrew when I moved to Israel about 20 years ago. It's a collection of creative stories based on the lives of Talmudic characters, many of them women, although not all of them. And what Ruth Calderon does, she vividly recreates these stories about a man who mistook his wife for a harlot, a young man and woman who spend their wedding night studying Torah together, a man who's nearly a rabbi who's nearly seduced by his study partner's wife. A lot of these stories are sexy, romantic, alluring. They really come to life off the page. Ruth Calderon is a secular Jewish educator and a former member of Knesset, and she's a firm believer that Talmud and all Jewish sacred texts really are our national treasures as Jews, and that they're there for all Jews to access and to enjoy, which is something I also believe very, very firmly. As Jews, we don't have, a national palace with crown jewels. Our treasures are our texts. In fact, the rabbis teach in Pirkei Avot, there are 3 crowns. There's the crown of kingship for the kings. There's the crown of the priesthood for the priests. And then there's the crown of Torah. And the crown of Torah lies there, and anyone who wants to can come access it. And I think that's what Ruth Calderon's book did for me. It made me realize that the Talmud was a text that I could access as well on my own terms. At the time I read her book, I was going through a difficult period in my life. I was getting divorced. I had very recently moved to Israel. I was living in Jerusalem, thousands of miles from my family and friends back in New York. And at the suggestion of a friend, and in part thanks to the influence of Ruth Calderon's book, I decided to start learning Daf Yomi, a page of Talmud a day. I was feeling really stuck in my life, and it was a way for me to put one foot in front of the other by turning page after page. Prior to reading Ruth Calderon's book, I thought of the Talmud as a dry legal text, and a text in which most of the women were either some rabbi's wife or daughter. Very few had independent identities. But Calderon made the characters of the Talmud come alive for me, and I wanted to get to know them better. I didn't know Ruth Calderon at all. At the urging of a friend, I had recently started a blog, but I thought, you know what I'll do? I'm going to try to translate the chapter I fell in love with most from her book, and I can put it on my blog and no one will ever see it. I think at the time, that was one of the first books I translated, if not the first book. And I really felt this sense of, when you read something and you love it so much, at least for me, I want to write it. I want to rewrite it. I want to be the author of that story. It's like the Borges story about Pierre Menard and the Quixote. I wanted to be the author. I wanted to write that story. And so the way I could have ownership over something I loved, I'm not going to copy. I have copied out poems. I copy out poems all the time that I love, but I was going to translate it. I was going to write it in my native tongue. And then also I could hopefully share it with people who wouldn't have access to the original Hebrew. So I translated it truly as a labor of love. And somehow I got connected with Ruth, and she said to me, do you want to do the whole book? And I thought, I'm not really a translator. I just love your book. And that was I think it was my first foray into translation. But then I went on to translate a series of books by Rabbi Benny Lau about the rabbis of the Talmud. I've now translated 4 books for him in total. And with each book, I became more and more familiar with another generation of the characters who populate the Talmud. So I can really credit Ruth Calderon's book with being an inspiration for my own professional trajectory as a translator of Jewish books. Also, in some ways, I can also credit her book as being the inspiration for the book I wrote, my last book, If All the Seas Were Ink, which is a memoir of the 7.5 years of my life in which I got divorced, moved to Israel, remarried, gave birth to my first 3 children, all of which I set against the backdrop of the tractates of Talmud I was learning in Daf Yomi as all those personal developments were unfolding.
I want to go back to one piece, which is that you and Calderon both shared this very strong feminist sensibility and bring that to reading male-dominated texts. So tell me a little bit about that strain in you.
Yeah. I feel very fortunate because I grew up in a home where it was abundantly clear that anything men could do, women could do as well. As I said, my father was the rabbi of our synagogue, and my mother was a very senior executive in the Federation in New York City. The joke in our house was that our father was tending to the Jews of our community while our mother was saving Jews the world over. I really grew up thinking that I could do whatever I wanted. And being a woman, being a Jewish woman, was not in any sense a handicap. I even remember at one point, like, I don't know, it must have been like 9 years ago, because I was pregnant with my fourth child. And I was sitting it was a weekday morning prayer service, and someone said a prayer that usually people say at home. It's not generally said out loud in a synagogue context, but it was the prayer about not making me a woman. It's part of the traditional liturgy. I remember hearing that blessing and saying to myself, I was sitting there, 8 or 9 months pregnant, whatever it was, and I said to myself, that's crazy. Like, thank God for making me a woman. And more than that, thank God for making me a woman in the 21st century, because I don't know any men who can both birth a child and study Torah. Like, I'm so lucky that I'm living when I am. And so when I came to the study of Jewish texts, I think unlike a lot of my contemporaries, I didn't come to it with like a chip on my shoulder in any sense, or a sense that I had been wronged in any way. I really felt that I wanted to get to know these characters, and I wanted to be a part of plowing through texts that really had been studied for generations primarily by men, and were really fertile ground for gleaning new insights, because I think women don't read text the same way as men, and that's not a gendered statement, in the same way that no two people read a text the same way, and no one person even reads a text the same way at multiple points in his or her life. So I just felt like these texts are they're just waiting. It's like the crown of Torah is just sitting there in the corner waiting for someone to don it. And here I was. And I discovered that as I was reading these texts, and this is something I wrote about in If All the Seas Were Ink, I really felt like I identified much more with the men of the Talmud than with the women of the Talmud, because here I was, an independent woman, supporting myself. At the time, I was not married. I was living alone in an apartment that I was paying my rent for out of my own paycheck, neither living in my father's home nor my husband's home, like the women in the Talmud had to be, or else they had no recourse, and studying Torah, of course. And I thought to myself, well, by the Talmud standards, I'm really a Jewish man. And it was really the men of the Talmud who became my heroes. And so that, for me, was a very liberating experience, because I didn't feel narrowly confined to only a small set of minor bit characters, right? I could be cheering for and identify with anyone I wanted in the text. So, learning Jewish texts is a very important part of my life. And I feel so lucky that, given the way that I grew up, I really feel very comfortable inside the world of these texts, even though, yes, they are primarily dominated by men, and they have traditionally primarily been studied by men, but that has never held me back.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview, Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. I don't know if anybody hasn't read Charlotte's Web, but you can give us a very brief description of Charlotte's Web and then why you chose it as a book that changed your worldview.
I'll start by saying I think Charlotte's Web was the first chapter book I read with each of my kids. It's not just a story about a pig and a spider in a barn, as many people think of it. It's a really profound meditation on friendship, about how friendship can really save your life, which is something I deeply believe. It's about what it means to feel truly invested in another person, or I should say in another creature's welfare, the way that Charlotte the spider is in Wilbur the pig, and what this means both for the one who is invested in and for the one who does the investing. Because I think that the relationship is as important to Wilbur, the pig who's being fattened for slaughter on Christmas, as it is to Charlotte, who saves his life. It's also a story beyond friendship. It's a story about literacy, I think. It's a story about how being able to read and to write can set you free, which is another one of the themes I explore in my book in the context of the Exodus. It's not surprising that Charlotte's Web is one of the first chapter books that many kids encounter. It's right up there, I think, with, I would say, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the Ramona books, those first books that kids read on their own competently, because the book really celebrates the miracles wrought by being literate. The miracle is that Charlotte, because she's able to read and write, is able to save Wilbur's life. The book ends when Charlotte's too old and frail to return from the county fair where Wilbur is exhibited, and she tells Wilbur that she's going to die. And the book ends with a sort of elegy for Charlotte, lines that I have quoted so many times. It is not often that someone comes along who's a true friend and a good writer. Charlotte was both. I I cannot read those words without crying. I remember part of the reason this book had such a profound impact on me is because it was the first sad book I read as a child. I read it to myself, and I remember I felt so shocked and betrayed. I had never finished a book that didn't have a happy ending before. I mean, Charlotte's Web has partially a happy ending, but also a deeply sad ending. I just didn't know that books could end like that. It was like someone had broken all the rules. And it's a book that's been really important to me to read with my children because it's a reminder that not all endings are happy, but sad endings can be beautiful and poignant and can touch us very deeply. My kids are always embarrassed to witness it, but I cry at the end of so many of the books we read together, even when the endings aren't sad. I don't know, something about coming to the end sensitizes me to the passage of time. The book is over. The era of reading that particular book with my children at this particular age is past. We'll never have these minutes again. And I guess part of the reason the text resonated for me and I wrote about it in my book is because on the latest rereading, I really started to think of it as being in dialogue with the book of Exodus. The parallels to me are very striking. Charlotte's Web begins, of course, with a newborn pig who's fated to die. But Fern, she convinces her father to save this little piglet. And then Fern sits every day on the milking stool watching over Wilbur, this pig who's been spared death, from a distance. Likewise, flash to the Exodus story. The Exodus story begins with a newborn baby, Moses, who's fated to die, right? Pharaoh's, of course, ordered that all the newborn males have to be thrown into the Nile. But his mother puts him in a basket, places him in the Nile, and his sister watches over him from a distance, like Fern. So I think this is just, I wanted to give this example. I think it's just one of several examples I talk about in the book of how a book that's clearly not really in dialogue with the Exodus, I doubt it ever crossed E.B. White's mind, and I'm really in favor of giving authors the benefit of the doubt with all possible connotations, but nonetheless, a book can still take on new meaning when read against the backdrop of Torah and read as a commentary on that text.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, 3 Days in Summer by Yossi Avni Levi.
The book I'm reading right now is called 3 Days in August by Yossi Avni Levi. It's a book about a group of misfits in a small Lithuanian town in August 1941. The novel's told from these alternating perspectives, and we get a window into each individual's frustrations and aspirations, and it all happens against the backdrop of the dazzling lakes and wild forests of the lush Lithuanian countryside. But the whole novel, what's amazing about it is it's built on the incongruity of the beauty of the natural landscape and the shadow of encroaching evil, because the other perspective we're privy to is that there's an SS officer riding through the countryside on his motorcade and preparing to rid their town of all its Jewish inhabitants.
It's out in Hebrew, right?
It's out in Hebrew, but I actually am translating it right now, which is why I'm so steeped in it. It won all the top literary prizes in Israel last year. So I very, very, very much hope it's going to find its readership because it's a beautifully, beautifully written book, really about how history can take on a timeless dimension and how the timelessness of fiction can take on a historical dimension.
Great. We're going to keep an eye out. Do you know when it's going to be published in English?
Alas, if anyone listening to this podcast works for a publisher.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, please. We're not there yet. We're not at the stage of trying to sell it yet. I'm just finishing up the translation now, so let's hope.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Children of the Book by Ilana Kurshan. We talked a little bit about your first memoir, If All the Seeds Were Ink, and about your daily Talmud study, which became really a lifeline for you in transforming those really difficult moments. And then you talk in Children of the Book about motherhood as being a period of chaos, and you feared you'd never read to yourself again. Do you feel like the discipline of that daily Talmud study of Daf Yomi shaped how you carve time for reading?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Yes, to an extent. I'm the kind of person who finds it much easier to do something every day than to do something once a week or once in a blue moon. So once I commit to something, I'm pretty good at sticking with it. I shouldn't say good at it because it becomes compulsive and sometimes it's not such a good thing and it's to the exclusion of other far more important or at least pressing matters. But nonetheless, studying a page of Talmud every day was a good way of making sure that every day I spent at least a little bit of time doing what I love most, which is reading texts. Daf Yomi was sort of an initiation into what was it going to mean to balance my responsibilities as a parent with my passion for texts and for reading.
And you call your children infinitely rich texts, which is such a beautiful image. What have been some of the most surprising or profound moments of insight that you've gained from reading aloud to them, whether it's a sacred or secular book?
I think one of the first books that most parents read to their infants, and I mean like really infants, is a book. Well, our version of it was called Black and White. I imagine most are. It's a very, very simple book that's just a series of black images against a white background. And then you flip it over and there's white images against a black background. And I remember, I would read this book to my newborn son when he was still so young that he hadn't yet learned to distinguish day from night. And he was up most of the day and crying in the wee hours of the night. And I remember reading this book, and by reading, I just mean naming everything in those black or white images, bottle, boat, truck, whatever it was. And I remember thinking, wow, when is my son going to learn to distinguish black from white and darkness from light? And then I realized that that's really God's first act in creating the world, separating light from darkness. And then I realized that each time I read this book with my newborn son, it was as if I were drawing back the darkness so the light might appear distinct and his world might sharpen into focus. I was, in a sense, creating the world for him. And that made me think about how there's a midrash, a text of rabbinic exegesis. The rabbis say that even before the world was created, the Torah was created, that the Torah existed 2,000 years before the world was created. And in fact, the ancient rabbis say that just like an architect needs a blueprint to create the world, so too God could not construct the world without the blueprint that is Torah, which is to say that the world was preceded and predicated on a book, because books are really, and this made such intuitive sense to me, books are our guides to the world. So when I read to my son, I was teaching him how to make sense of his world, how to construct his world, how to discern the black images in the space that is not the surrounding white background, and later on how to tell good from evil and kindness from cruelty and right from wrong. And it really goes on because, after we read children that first, black and white board book, usually the next kinds of books, the next genre of books we read to little babies is the books that name objects from the baby's world. So every page has a picture. Generally, by then, the child can see more than just black and white. And so the images become full color. And I watched in wonder as each of my kids learned how to point with that tiny finger, the nails the size of like sesame seeds, right? As I read aloud the name of each item on the page and thought about how that was really how God created the world in the book of Genesis. God spoke the world into being. God said, "Let there be light." And by the power of God's word alone, there was light. And really, utterance by utterance, the world of Genesis resounded into being. And so for each of my newborns, it was as if the world were being summoned into existence then and there. And those were insights that I don't think would have come to me had I not had that experience of reading with my children.
It feels so intuitive that you weaved the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, along with the stories of the reading to your children. Just hearing you talk about it, it makes a lot of sense. You share these very personal stories about your children, and you tread carefully, and you write about how you're writing about them in terms of their reading lives and not as their fully fleshed out beings. How did you navigate that tension between the memoirist's impulse to reflect and your responsibility to protect your children's evolving identities?
Yes, that's something I think about a lot. I have to say this book was much harder to write than my previous book. In my previous book, which covered, the 7.5-year period when I studied Daf Yomi, In that book, my kids hadn't been born when the book began. When the book comes to an end, my oldest is 2 and my twins are newborns. So I had a lot more license to write about them as I saw fit without worrying about how they would respond. So I could say that one of my twins learned to crawl 3 months before the other without worrying that I was violating their confidence or betraying their trust, especially because I didn't say which twin was which, But this book was much harder. I wrote about a period in which my oldest was 10 and my youngest was 1. They're even older now. It takes a while to write a book, at least for me. And it felt very important to me to try as hard as I could not to write anything that they would be upset or uncomfortable reading one day. So sometimes this meant changing some details to be faithful to the emotional truth of a moment, if not to the specific details of what happened, as it were. And I'm open in the book about having done so. I wasn't after historical accuracy. I was really after some deeper emotional truth. This book is not about what happened in our lives. It's really about what it felt like to raise children in a house full of books, a house where reading was what drew us close. And it also, I think, trying to have that sensitivity, it also meant really leaving my husband mostly out of the book because I felt like this was my story to tell, and I have no doubt that he would tell it differently and that his way would ring equally true. And it also meant reading a lot out loud to my kids from the book and explaining to them what I was trying to do. So at this point, my kids have read most of this, or I should say heard most of this book. But yes, it's much harder to write about your children when they're older. And I think that's why there's so many memoirs about mothers of newborns. For a while, I was just collecting them and noticing how they all have in common these very short, choppy, either very short chapters or one paragraph fragmentary style, because that's how you write when you're the mother of a young, very young child. Anyway, and there are far fewer memoirs about mothers of teens. And in a way, I guess my model for this was Shirley Jackson, who is a writer I deeply admire. Her second memoir, Raising Demons, is about parenting her 4 children. And she really manages somehow, it's extraordinary, to be at once witty and compassionate, deadpan and devoted. I really learned from Jackson that it's possible to be funny, but not at one's children's expense, that, to laugh with them, not at them.
And having read so many different books with 5 different children, I guess what I'm wondering is if the experience of reading one book really stands out, that felt like it changed how you saw that book, how you saw your child, that experience of reading together was a unique experience.
So there's one children's picture book that has a very important role in the way I've related to all of my kids. And it's a book called Before You Were Born by Harold Schwartz. And it's a book about a parent, a father, telling a child what happened to that child in the womb before the child was born, what it was like. It's based on a midrash about how a child learns all about the world when in the womb, and then when the child is born, an angel, it's a famous midrash, right? The angel slaps the child or knocks the child under the nose, and that's how you get that indentation above your upper lip, and the child forgets everything they've learned. It's very beautifully written. When you read it, it's almost like poetry. It doesn't rhyme or anything, but the book has such musicality and such powerful rhythm and cadences. And it's the one book that was able to soothe my children, or most of my children, when they would have tantrums or lose control. There was something about the experience of reading that book that reminded, I don't know, it was some sort of connection, like you were once a part of me, and we're on the same team here, and we're on the same page here. And that was a very powerful reading experience with each of my kids. But there's so many books I could cite because we read in so many different contexts. There are the books that a lot of them food related, that we read at meal times all the time. We always read during dinner because that was the only way I could get them to stop fighting and focus on actually eating, so dinner could end and we could move on with the evening.
And what do you hope that readers take away from your experience of reading with your children about Torah and Jewish life?
Well, I think one of the points that I really tried to make in my book is that when you read texts in the context of other texts and against the backdrop of other texts, you really start to see how all later texts are commentary on earlier texts, are in dialogue with earlier texts. And I guess what I want to show is the richness when family life unfolds against a backdrop of reading together, how reading really becomes a way of relating and connecting and really being together with one's child. I hope that it will inspire parents to connect with their children through texts and to see themselves in those texts and to see those texts as conduits of their values and of their sources of meaning.
When I picked up the book and understood, I was like, how is this all going to work? The story of the Torah and the books, and you weave it together so beautifully and really do change how you read these children's books and change how you read these Torah stories in such a beautiful way. So thank you so much for sharing it with us. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tali.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 Books. Our guest today was Ilana Kurshan talking about her memoir, Children of the Book. You can find a link to the book and all the others Ilana discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the great books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram at 5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. And we have a newsletter. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed directly in your inbox, you can sign up in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. You can find transcripts for all episodes online there too at 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Sarah Waring. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Dina Friedman. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.